Hi, I'm Rob from B&H, and we're taking a look at the Analog Rytm from Elektron. The Rytm is a drum machine, and its arrival has been hotly anticipated because it combines analog sound generation with digital sample playback, making it really versatile. The Rytm features 12 velocity and pressure-sensitive pads that obviously trigger drum sounds, but can also be used to alter sounds in live performance, as we saw in that little intro demo. Now, that demo uses a lot of the Rythm's great-sounding distortion effect, but don't worry, we're going to dial that back and demo some cleaner beats as well. Now, taking a quick look at the hardware, the Rytm is a typical black box that Elektron has been producing lately, and power is supplied by a lump-in-line power supply. In addition to the pads, you get 9 endlessly rotating knobs for parameter adjustments that depend on the sound you've selected and the page you've called up with the buttons. This one over here is the track level knob that often does double duty for data entry and navigation. The encoder's indent, which is useful in 2 ways. If you press a knob without turning, you can see a parameter value without altering it. And if you press and turn a knob, you can change values at greater speeds. You can view parameters and values on the small backlit LCD screen. Down here are the buttons that select patterns and activate steps in the Elektron step sequencer. 8 banks for patterns are available, A through H, each with 16 patterns. So that's the box. To give you an idea of how the machine sounds, let me play a couple of the factory patterns and kits that are available on the Rytm when you turn it on. Now, each of the 12 pads plays a different sound, but you've only got 8 voices. That means that some of the pads or tracks share a voice while others don't. So the bass drum, snare drum, bass tom, and low tom each has a dedicated voice. The rim shot and the clap share a voice, as do the mid tom and high tom, the closed and open hat, and the cymbal and cowbell. If both of the pads that share a voice are triggered at the same time, the right pad takes precedence and mutes the left sound. So while that can be limiting, it's a logical way of dividing 8 voices among 12 tracks, and also allows the machine to do some cool and very musical choke functions. I should also point out that in addition to the TRS main outs on the back, there are 4 individual outputs that allow you to access all of the 8 voices using 1/4-inch insert cables. A 1/4-inch stereo input for external inputs, a MIDI in port, a MIDI out port, and a MIDI through and sync port are also on the back. The Analog Rytm can also receive MIDI through its USB port. In addition to playing sounds from the drum kits, these white buttons put the pads into different modes. In the chromatic mode, the 12 pads form a musical octave, allowing you to play a sound melodically, and you can use the up and down buttons to transpose the scale up and down. 3 other modes are great for performing. Mute mode is fairly self-explanatory. With scene mode, you can program parameter variations in a kit and trigger them by pressing a pad. In this pattern, I have scenes that alter the filters and then increase the decay on the hats to create a break. Performance mode is similar, but rather than a static on-off change, the multiple parameters can be modulated by the amount of pressure applied to a pad. So in this pattern, the harder I press the pad, the more I raise the filter cutoff and the amount of the effects, while the pad next to it does the same thing, but to more sounds in the kit, and thus creates a break that I can sort of sweep in by adding pressure and then letting go. The pads feel quite good to play, but I was surprised that there's no way to adjust the sensitivity on them. I'd love to see that in a future OS update. Now, a sound in the analog rhythm is generated from two primary sources, an analog circuit and a sample playback engine, although some settings offer a noise generator as well. Those are then routed to the filter and then an amp section, and they can also be modulated with an LFO. To select a sound to edit, you hold the track button and select the pad for the track. So the first thing you'll notice about these analog percussion sound generators is that they're not all the same for every voice. The analog circuit on the bass drum, for example, is the same as the snare drum, but it's different than the one on the hi-hats. So in other words, not every pad can make the same analog sound. This also means that not every sound on the plus drive library can be loaded into every pad. The digital control structure for the analog circuit is called a machine. So for the bass drum, for example, the default machine for that circuit is bass drum hard. But I could also choose bass drum classic, an FM bass drum, or even 3 different snare machine options, hard, classic, and FM. The snare drum uses the same type of circuit and consequently offers the same machine options, although its default machine is snare drum hard. Over here in hi-hat land, though, the available machines are closed hat classic and open hat classic, and again, that's because it uses a different type of analog circuit. The pad and machine you choose for the pad determines the types and number of parameters you have available for editing in the synth page. Some machines give you 2 oscillators to work with, others only 1. Some have more envelope features, some offer sweepable pitch envelopes, some have FM parameters. Suffice to say, some machines and circuits, especially this bottom row, are more tweakable than others. In addition to the analog circuit, each pad can also play back a sample, and unlike the analog circuits, the sample engine is the same for every pad. Parameters here are fairly basic: which sample is playing, its tuning, start and end points, bit rate, etc. Useful stuff, great for a drum machine, but certainly not as sophisticated as Elektron's Octatrack sampler. Samples are stored on the internal 1 GB plus drive. The Rhythm ships with a fairly reasonable assortment of samples on the drive, divided into 10 categories, and of course you can transfer your own samples to the drive via the USB port. Both the sample and analog engines go through each voice's multi-mode analog filter. Technically it's a resonant 2-pole filter, but some of the settings behave more like 1-pole filters if you're looking for EQ controls. I really like Elektron's filters. This one is no exception, and in addition to cutoff frequency and resonance amounts, offers extensive envelope control for sound sculpting. After the filter is the amp section. In addition to panning and envelope settings for the amp, this is where you can dial in the overdrive circuit, which, even though it's in the amp section, is actually before the filter. This is also where you can send the sound to the rhythm's delay and reverb effects, both of which offer a lot of editable parameters and sound very good. Also terrific sounding are the distortion and compression effects for the mix output, and the effects track also has a dedicated LFO. To give you a taste of some of the effects, in this performance mode demo I have pad 3 increasing the amount of distortion and delay overdrive, and that along with a compressor is yielding a really cool pumping delay effect. To create patterns, you'll use Elektron's famous step sequencer. Press the record button and you're in grid recording mode. Select the track that you want and then just light up the steps that you want. Patterns can be up to 64 steps in length, which is 4 bars if you're in 4/4 time. Basic values for the trigger are in the trigger page, and if you hold the trigger down and adjust a parameter, that value will be locked to that trigger. These parameter locks, or P-locks, have numerous uses. Obviously, you can lock velocity values to give your patterns a little life, but it doesn't stop there. Envelope settings, filter settings, reverb and delay settings, P-locks give you a lot of options. You can also do sound locks, so a trigger can switch to an entirely different sound. You can also do a trigless lock, which doesn't trigger a drum but triggers parameter changes on a sound already playing. In this example, I have a trigless P lock that changes the LFO amount on the sound's filter cutoff frequency as it sustains. The other recording mode is live recording mode, where you hold the record button down and hit play, and then you simply play the part you want using the pads. Your playing can be quantized automatically, or you can go back and quantize after the fact. You can also add micro-timing offsets, swing, and accents to give your beats a more human feel. The Rytm also features an adjustable re-trigger function, handy for creating rolls and triplet patterns, which is how I did this little blippy part. At the moment, you can only program re-triggers in grid mode, but Elektron tells us that live re-trigger recording will be available on a future OS. Patterns, tracks, triggers, and more can all be copied and pasted as needed, and patterns can be strung together to make chains and songs for entire compositions. I was personally very impressed with the Analog Rytm and really enjoyed working with it, but it's not for everyone. It ain't cheap, the screen is small, there are a couple of minor bugs in the current OS, and if you haven't used Elektron stuff before, there is a learning curve. But there are some shortcuts built in, and like any instrument, you'll get faster with practice. Also, the Rytm doesn't ship with the kind of extensive library of samples and sounds that you get with computer-based software-hardware systems like Machine, the Akai MPCs, or the Triggerfinger Pro, although we are beginning to see sample libraries for it available for purchase from the Elektron site. On the other hand, the real analog circuitry under digital control makes the Rytm sound very special. The Rytm delivers excellent electronic sounds that can be altered in all kinds of creative ways and are especially spot on for techno, house, and EDM productions, but I think you could do some killer hip-hop and R&B grooves with it as well. Also, its performance, scene, and mute modes make it a monster for performing live, while sample playback also gives it added impact and versatility. I should also add that Elektron has announced the forthcoming Overbridge implementation for the Analog Rytm, as well as the Analog 4 and Analog keys, which promises a more seamless integration of those pieces into the DAW on your Mac or PC. When this new OS arrives, multiple voices from these instruments will show up on separate tracks in your DAW via USB for fast multi-track recording, as well as VST and AU processing. You'll also be able to send tracks from your DAW to your Elektron gear for processing and back without latency. So if this works as planned, it's really going to improve the workflow for a lot of users. So hopefully this video gives you a reasonable overview of the Analog Rytm 8-voice drum computer from Elektron. I'm Rob from B&H, and thanks for watching.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.